Let's continue in our study in the Gospel of John. We are now in chapter 18, verses 10, 11, and 12. Just 3 verses now. The last thing that John includes in his explanation of how the Lord Jesus was arrested is Peter's attempt to rescue his master, the Lord Jesus Christ, with a sword, and the Lord's rebuke of Peter. Chapter 18, verse 10. Therefore, Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. Now the name of the slave was Malchus. So now our attention turns to one of those men given to the Lord Jesus by the Father. Although the Lord Jesus has just arranged for the 11's safe exit by asking twice, "Whom do you seek?" Peter jeopardizes all that by using a sword or a knife, we'll talk about that later, a sword or a knife to attack one of the men that were wanting to arrest the Lord Jesus. Peter simply could not understand that the Messiah had to suffer. Remember what happened back in Mark 8, 31 through 33? Let me read that passage. Verse 31. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Verse 32, he spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Verse 33, but when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." The Lord Jesus was explaining about his suffering and death, and Peter rebuked him. Let's be sure that we never rebuke the Lord Jesus, telling him, for instance, that the suffering he is allowing us or our loved ones isn't right. Now back to our text. Even at this point, here in chapter 18, Peter still does not understand that the Messiah must suffer. This was Peter's consistent attitude whenever the Lord Jesus told him about the cross or the coming suffering which he, the Lord, would endure. Peter simply could not understand that the Lord Jesus would suffer, despite the Lord's repeated explanations about this. However, before we too quickly condemn Peter, we should note that even today, some Christians make a similar mistake. Some Christians today seem to be less interested in carrying their own cross, less interested in furthering evangelism, discipleship, and church planting, and more interested in making sure that a Christian political party gains influence or even control of the government. We may be more like Peter than we want to admit. Let's work, let's concentrate, and let's have the mindset of the Lord and not Peter in all things, including the relationship between our faith and political power. Now, back to our text. About this sword, in our minds, there is a clear difference between a sword and a knife, but it simply was not so in the Greek language. The word used here, machaira, originally in the earlier history of the language, referred to a knife, but by the time of the New Testament, it could also refer to a sword. It is simply not clear what Peter drew out. Was it a sword or a knife in our language? Any translator of the New Testament, including the translators of the translation that you prefer, has to deal with the fact that the word he or she finds in the Greek New Testament here, machaira, is ambiguous. It could mean knife and it could mean sword. Now, whether it was a sword or a knife, somehow Peter cut off an ear with it. We do not really know enough about the situation then to know why Peter would even have that sword or knife, or why the disciples would have two makairai, swords or knives, as mentioned in Luke 22:38. The term used here, again, makaira, is also used in Romans 13:4, which explains that the government has the power to carry out capital punishment. The government does not bear the sword, the makaira, in vain. Clearly, in Romans 13:4, the makaira is a sword. People are not executed with knives. They were executed with swords, though. However, that does not prove that when this word makaira is used in our passage, it has to mean sword. We simply don't know. There is another Greek word, rhomphaia, that has to be translated sword. Liddell and Scott, in their massive lexicon of the Greek language, tells us that this word means large, broad sword. That word, rhomphaia, is only found 7 times in the New Testament. That is, once in Luke and 6 times in the book of Revelation. Now, back to John 18. It does seem very strange or awkward that somehow Peter cut off the man's ear with that sword or knife. It is possible that Peter was a skilled swordsman and intentionally cut off that ear, but it seems much more likely that Peter, skilled with fishing nets, but apparently not with swords, struck out wildly and happened to cut off an ear. And even so, what was Peter thinking? Would he, with one sword, be able to single-handedly drive off the detachment of armed men that had come to arrest his rabbi? All 4 Gospels record this event, but only here do we learn the name of the servant, Malchus. Later in this chapter, in verse 16, we read, "But Peter stood outside near the door, so the other disciple who was known by the high priest went out, and he spoke to the doorkeeper, and he brought Peter in." So there in chapter 18, verse 16, we read that John was known by the high priest. We don't know the details of that. It's kind of mysterious how a Galilean fisherman could have been known by the high priest, but he was. So John, who was known by the high priest, may also have known Malchus by name. Chapter 18, verse 11. Therefore Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into its sheath. The cup which the Father has given me to drink, shall I not drink it?" Peter's effort was not only in vain, it also went against the Lord's purpose. In both the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of John, the Lord Jesus instructs Peter to return the sword to its place. But the rebuke in John focuses the reader's attention on the Lord Jesus and the task he was moving towards, while the rebuke in Matthew focuses on the sword. In other words, according to what John emphasizes, Peter must put that sword into its sheath so as to not hinder the divine plan that was proceeding. While Matthew emphasizes that Peter must put his sword into its sheath so that he will not be killed by another sword. This is another example of what some would call a contradiction. Again, this so-called contradiction is easily resolved. Both sentences were uttered by the Lord Jesus, but one was recorded by John and the other was recorded by Matthew. The figurative use of drinking the cup is also found in the Lord's Prayer in Gethsemane, which is not recorded in the Gospel of John. The Lord's question, "The cup which the Father has given me to drink, shall I not drink it?" is clearly a rhetorical question. A rhetorical question. That means the Lord Jesus was not asking for Peter's advice here. This cup which the Father gave him to drink clearly refers to his death on the cross. although the Father had many tasks for the Lord Jesus to do while he was on earth, this, going to the cross and dying, was the ultimate task that he was given to do. Chapter 18, verse 12. Therefore the detachment and the commander and the servants of the Jews seized Jesus and bound him. Here it becomes clear and emphatic that both Rome, the detachment and commander, and Jerusalem, the servants of the Jews, were represented in this evil act. Now, often, but not always, the expression the Jews in the Gospel of John refers to the leaders of the Jewish people in the province of Judea who opposed the Lord Jesus. For exceptions to that pattern, you can see chapter 4, verse 9, chapter 4, verse 22, chapter 11, verse 45, and chapter 12, verse 11. But most of the time, the expression the Jews refers to the leaders of the Jewish people. Why that's so? It's just a peculiarity of the Gospel of John. And this is most clear in chapter 7, verse 13, which reads, "Even so, no one was speaking openly about him because of the fear of the Jews." Well, if you think about that, in 7:13, the people that were afraid, they were Jews. But they were afraid of the Jews, meaning they were afraid of the leaders of the Jewish people. So at least sometimes the expression the Jews, as here, doesn't refer to all Jewish people, it refers to the leaders. And we note here that they did not arrest Peter or any of the 11, but John does not explain why Peter was allowed to go free even though he'd injured Malchus. From Luke 22, we understand that Malchus' ear was healed, and perhaps that is why Peter was not arrested. So by way of summary, the last thing that John includes in his explanation about how the Lord Jesus was arrested is Peter's attempt to rescue his master, the Lord Jesus, with a sword, and the Lord's rebuke of Peter. With these words, the explanation of how the I am, the one who could raise Lazarus from the dead, the one who could calm the winds and the waves, could somehow be arrested by some Roman soldiers and some servants of the Jewish leaders, that explanation comes to a close. The key word here is willingly. He let them arrest him because that was the will of the one who sent him.